I am Laura Quinn. I am the Executive Director of Idealware. I've been doing a number of these seminars with LSNTAP over the course of a couple of years. I'm with Idealware, which is we are a nonprofit ourselves, which specializes in research and articles and training.
Sorry, in fact, the recording came on in the middle of your introduction, Peter, if you could just quickly...
quickly again, Peter Campbell, CIO at Legal Services Corporation. I have a fair amount of experience with dashboards throughout my career, not so much here where we're about to build one, but at other companies where I've worked.
Great. Fantastic. And Kristin?
Hi, I'm Kristin Verrill. I'm the Practice Innovation Manager at Atlanta Legal Aid. I'm an attorney, and I just do a bunch of our tech work, and we are trying to finish up our one of our TIG grant projects that is building a dashboard in our case management system called Legal Server.
Fantastic. Great, so this is what we're going to go through today, and it kind of can give you a sense of the flow for, like, for instance, questions you might want to ask and when, because we love your questions. So we're going to just start by briefly talking about what a dashboard is and what types of things might be in it for a legal aid organization. And then we're going to talk through 7 steps to think about in creating your own dashboard. We find that in this area, people often get kind of hung up on the technology aspects, which are not necessarily, certainly they're worth thinking about, but probably not a primary guiding element in a lot of these projects. So we're going to actually talk through kind of the process of defining it, starting with defining what it is you're doing, who and what it's for, what your users want, and then figuring out the metrics that you actually dashboard, which might be one of the most difficult things here. Then choosing your actual technology platform for the dashboard, thinking about your charts and graphs, your displays, implementing, rolling out, so all of this really critical change management type stuff, and then iteration, which we've done some research in this area, and over we hear that iteration is just a really key thing to do in the dashboard area specifically. We'll be looking at a lot of examples throughout, but then we'll wind up with 3 specific case studies, including talking for about 10 or 15 minutes about what they're doing over at Atlanta Legal Aid. So then, guideposts for today. All right, so let's talk about what a dashboard is. So the idea of a dashboard is it consolidates information to help you look at a bunch of places. So like a dashboard of a cockpit, which is what we're looking at here, it's not just one thing or one graph, it's a bunch of things together with the idea that you could conceptually print it out and hand it to your executive director, and she would be able to look at it and get a snapshot view of, maybe a number of different metrics around one area. So you want to think about what data it is that you are summarizing up in a dashboard. So this could be lots of things. It could be more operational, it could be programs, it could be impact. So let's dive into those a little bit. So here's kind of an example of some more operational dashboards. So this is the idea of helping people with their day-to-day work or helping management to supervise day-to-day work. So the examples we have here, for instance, are over here on the left. This is an LSNTAP kind of project management dashboard where you can see, okay, here are late and upcoming milestones. Here's things that are due in the next 14 days. There's actually a list that we've covered up, which is a list of projects. So it's kind of bringing in together things that, that LSNTAP is thinking of doing. Over here on the right-hand side, we've got one which is looking at, from Utah Legal Services, which is one of the case studies we'll look at in a little more detail at the end. It's looking at whether or not there are unchanged case notes in the system. So you can, for instance, see here that Bob has very few, has very few case notes in the systems that are have not been updated in 30 days, while apparently Terry is just doing a crappy job. By the way, these names have been changed. Terry is doing a crappy job in updating her case notes. So basically, this is an example of some dashboards to help you understand some kind of key operational things. You could also look at more specific things. So things like the average time a case is open, the time spent per program. These are both graphs pulled from the Atlanta Legal Aid Society. These are, by the way, these are pieces of dashboards. You would probably have multiple of these together on a dashboard to be able to kind of see everything at a glance. So these are things that are showing some more, some more boiled down information. And you could ideally get to the most boiled down information, which is the program impact. So what good are you actually doing in the world? And this is really difficult stuff, but you can try to get at it by things like looking at, down here on the bottom left, the client satisfaction levels, over here on the right, the number of, in fact, cases by substantive legal category. So you can think about what metrics you're using as a proxy for the impact you're having in the world. And as I mentioned, we're going to talk about software, but there is unfortunately dashboard software, which is going to just create this all for you. This is mostly, in fact, a matter of figuring out what it is that you want and how to measure it, as opposed to thinking about the software doing much for you. All right, so that was an overview of just written large the idea of dashboards before we go through the 7 steps. Peter, things to add, things just in people's conceptual frame to what a dashboard is or might be.
Well, I'll just share that, the first place I built a dashboard was the Goodwill I was working at in the 2000s, and we really we wanted a dashboard that did show how effective we were being at accomplishing our mission. So we started right with our mission statement and values to find the metrics that were important. As Laura pointed out, dashboards can measure different things. And at Goodwill, we had our overall mission, which was really to transform lives, take people out of joblessness and poverty and homelessness and improve that. And then we had a lot of outputs that our funders were very interested in, such as, the number of people placed in jobs and the salaries that they did. So the dashboard that we were building there fit multiple purposes. Right. So those types of things to think about.
Kristin, thoughts to kind of just add to our framing up of stuff before we dive into the details?
Hi, am I unmuted, first of all?
You are.
Okay, great. So, yeah. We wanted our dashboard to serve 2 purposes. One was to help as a management tool, and the other was to help our executive team promote our services in the community. So those are the purposes of our dashboard.
Great.
And
fantastic. All right, so let's dive in. That's actually a great transition, Kristin, to the first of our 7 steps, which is basically to figure out why you're doing what you're doing. Because dashboards could be a lot of different things. You want to make sure that you're not just kind of chasing like the mythical beast of the dashboard, and you've actually defined what you're doing it for. So thinking about, okay, who's the highest priority users of this dashboard? Is this dashboard for your ED and the board? Is this dashboard for attorneys? Pretty different things. Say that, okay, maybe, certainly attorneys get to look at it too, but saying that our primary user is the board is going to make it a very different dashboard than our primary user is our attorneys. You want to think about whether your goal is to centralize things. So, and then we have the opposite on the next slide. But so you want everybody to be able to see the same metrics to help keep everyone on the same page. This is a very common goal of a dashboard. And if this is a goal, who is it that you're trying to keep on the same page? Is it just your attorneys? Is it the board? Is it the public? Is it funders? Who are you actually trying to get onto the same page? So the opposite of trying to centralize things is allowing staff to create their own dashboard. So a dashboard doesn't necessarily mean that the same entire organization. In fact, there's systems like Salesforce is what we're looking at here, so not really highly used in the legal aid sector, but built around the idea of people creating their own customized dashboard. So there's systems that make it straightforward for everybody to be able to see exactly the information they need on their own individual dashboard. So that can be super useful, but it doesn't help everybody get on the same page if that's your goal. So is it more important to support people day to day, hour and hour with their own job, or to get them onto the same page? It's basically which is the goal of your particular dashboard, because they probably don't go together, at least not without a lot of different, pages and stuff within the same dashboard. Do you want to allow people to serve themselves? So to be able to say, okay, I want to see this data whenever I need it, rather than going through someone central? Or is it appropriate to say, okay, this dashboard is for the ED and the board, and we're simply going to produce it monthly and send it to them, so they don't need to be able to date at any moment. Instead, we're going to say that there's kind of a gathering process. And just in to wrap this up, this whole theme, it's really important to define what specifically success is going to look like, what you're biting off first, and what in general that might mean. Because this even more than most technology projects, a dashboard project is one where it's really easy to get yourself in this never-ending cycle of, okay, well, this other person wanted this other thing, and so we're going to add that, and okay, so we're still not going to roll it out. So you can really just go forever on the hamster wheel trying to get something that's everything to all people. And so you really want to say, okay, what's something small-ish on and achieve, and then, as we talked about, we'll talk specifically about iterating. What can we achieve, and then we will iterate and possibly make it bigger or more tailored or less tailored or whatever. Kristin, thoughts about kind of what this meant to you, thinking through finding what your dashboard was for?
Well, because it was TIG grant, we kind of knew who it was for when we wrote the application. I mean, the original project was designed so that it was going to be for our executive team. And then me being who I am and me loving project creep, I've just said, well, let's make it useful to everybody. And so then we added a layer so we're going to have two versions of the probably more than two versions. So I didn't want to do something just for our executive team, because I saw that information would also be useful to our managers as a supervision tool, and possibly our case handlers as a work management tool. So the technology we chose allows us to customize the dashboard by user type. So we're building the master dashboard for our executive team, and then and that's the intended audience of the project, and the kind of the bonus or the icing on the cake are the other dashboards that get created as a result of that.
Great. Terrific. And Peter, thoughts on kind of this whole idea of defining your project up front before you get underway?
Well, I always say that particularly when you're dealing with any kind of developing a database, which is as similar to because you're developing a data set, the more you know going into it, the more success you'll have. That if you start out with a bunch of conceptions about what you're trying to do and change them, you're creating a lot of work for yourself.
Right.
And the other thing that I kind of wanted to add when I was listening to you was, and it's kind of a counter to what I just said, is that so of course, ideally, you want to know what data you want to present, what the story your dashboard is going to tell, and shoot for that. But I think in the real world, because of some of the limitations of our data systems, there are some easy wins, data that you can pull right up and easily display. And then there's some stuff that might be very critical, but it's very hard to get at, because to get the metric you're actually looking for, the data sources are in three different applications or something like that. So, sometimes I'll prioritize based on what can I, get up in a hurry as opposed to what do we ideally want. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. Whoops. All right, so hopefully we didn't lose Kristin. Yes, I definitely agree with that. There's a tension between getting something up and running that people can iterate and look at and get a sense of, and the idea of so the opposite of that would be saying, all right, we need to know exactly what we're doing in every nuance before we can move. So trying to figure out the right line between those. So you want to understand what your users want from your dashboard. So, and this basically, it actually is potentially somewhat more straightforward to understand what they want than in a much more, open-ended area. Because this is fundamentally, you want to understand what information they need to make decisions, whatever goal you're talking about. So you want to get them together, talk about how they are using information to make these decisions. And you want to really pay attention to, and more attention is pretty bold, but pay attention to gaps and workarounds. So basically, if they say they want something, definitely ask how they're currently getting that information. And if the answer is, well, they don't really bother because it's a pain, but they would really use it, take it a grain of salt, as opposed to them saying, yes, I really need this information, and we spend, 10 hours every month gathering that by hand. That 10 hours a month information is clearly information that they are actually using and they definitely need. A thing that, in fact, I have done a lot of this work in my career. I don't know, dashboards were also a big thing in the corporate world like 10 years ago. A thing that is very useful in this particular area is to ask people to consider their magical dashboard. So basically, okay, if you could get one piece of paper every, whatever your time frame is, every day, every week, every month, what would be paper to help you to understand how to move forward? And to literally work with them to draw it out on a piece of paper. This can be really powerful. And my experience is that some of the stuff you'll get will be crazy blue sky stuff that you will never achieve. So you obviously want to, manage their expectations actually getting this piece of paper. But some of the things that they'll write on the paper, they're like, oh, well, I know we could never have this, but I'd really love to know, the percentage of cases that were closed this week. And you're like, oh, well, that's pretty easy. We could do that. I didn't really know you needed that. So there can sometimes be some really useful information that's gone overlooked here. And think through whether they need, do they need the Volkswagen or do they need the Ferrari? It's always nice to have a Ferrari, but think through what they really need. So do they complex indicators? Do they need to tailor? Do they need to be real into the details? Do they need to be able to do scenario planning? There's some requirements that people will throw out there that actually get very complicated. So you definitely want to probably bite off first the Volkswagen and then build it out into the Ferrari. Peter, that sounds like a topic that you will likely have much to say about, the idea of figuring out between the Volkswagen and the Ferrari.
Well, yeah, because I'm very pragmatic in how I approach things. But I think, and I think in our world, our sector, the pragmatism is a good thing. We don't have a ton of resources, and our staff are going to be understanding if we're not putting out the most beautiful dashboard on earth. I looked at 2 log management applications yesterday because we need to get for IT and something that helps us monitor our Windows logs and things like that. And one of them was very plain looking, functional, simple to set up, and the other one was beautiful. I mean, it looked like Apple designed it. And I think it cost about 5 times as much as the first one we saw. So I'm definitely leaning towards the first one.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. And thinking through the real needs there, where it sounds log stuff, the user buy-in is probably not going to be a huge factor there. So in fact, the beauty is not necessarily a need. Yeah.
In this case, it's only me and my staff who are ever going to be looking at it, so it's certainly. But I have definitely been in situations in my career where the presentation was kind of critical. Right. I don't know, so to factor that in, if it's a point towards the success of the project, they're not going to buy into it if it doesn't look pretty.
Yep, absolutely.
That's a real world concern.
Absolutely. Kristin, you want to talk about either what you did or what you feel like you might have been able to do in this realm of just kind of understanding what people wanted out of the dashboard?
I could answer that question a little bit with Northwest Justice Project also has a dashboard grant. One of the things that we're looking at specifically is mapping out census data information and then looking at where our cases are and seeing if there's particular populations that we are not reaching out to well, and then focusing outreach based on those. So it would be putting together a dashboard that includes a map, external census data, our internal case data that a senior attorney in a regional office could look at.
Great. Fantastic. Kristin, thoughts here on understanding what your users wanted out of it?
So in my experience, our program really had a very abstract idea of what they, let's have dashboards and let's manipulate our data and let's, show our economic output and let's have maps. And then they had very few tangible ideas on what they actually wanted to do with the dashboard, except I knew and so I had a very sweet intern who went around and interviewed everybody and got very blank stares from everybody who would be a potential user of our dashboard. And so what I ended up doing is talking to them. Basically, I didn't ask them to draw out a picture of a dashboard because people really just didn't know what that was. But I basically said, what reports do you need all the time, and what reports do you wish you had that you can't figure out how to make in Legal Server, which is our case management system. And I used that to help me create the dashboard. And I also used the maps that were made about 15 years ago by LSC that are all over my office that my executive director gave me. And he said, well, see this map? This is useless. See this map? This is really helpful. Give me a new one. And so that's basically what I did. I basically got as much feedback as I could, and then I just tried to make sense out of it. And then now that I have something tangible to show, I'm getting actually meaningful feedback that is like, oh, well, I need to know this from this graph, so tweak it in this way. So in my experience, you need something a little more tangible than let's make a dashboard for most people, at least in my organization. So.
Yep, absolutely. Yes, no, and my magical dashboard was not look like, but would be like literally you're getting a piece of paper. What's on that piece of paper? Yeah, and in fact, so you're just hearing the same thing over and over. I totally agree that iteration is kind of the name of the game there. That it's very hard for people to think about it conceptually, but when you put something in front of them, it's easier for them to respond.
What's that sports baseball movie? If you build it, they will come. Like if you build it, they'll use it, and then they'll criticize it, and then you'll be able to make it better, and then they'll use it more. So.
One other thing I'd throw in there, a strategy that I've used is, because I've been there too, where the people who need the dashboard have no idea to tell me what they want. Start with your finance people. They're good at it. They know what metrics they want to see, so they'll give you good input, and then you've got something to show other people. Like, this is what it looks like. This is how it's working for finance. What could it do for you?
Yeah,
right. In my situation, that was our grants manager.
Yeah,
she knew what she needed to display to funders and donors to either get more money or what.
Yep. Great. Fantastic. All right, so number 3, and this is probably the hardest and the most conceptual, is basically to figure out what metrics are actually you're going to use. And this is, so Peter alluded to exactly this. So you got to find overlap between what you want to know and what you actually have or could collect. There's no point in designing kind of the whole framework for a dashboard around data that you don't have, and it's going to be, a $100,000 initiative to collect that. That's not a good place to start with a dashboard. You want to start with, okay, what could we actually know? So you want to think through what metrics will actually specifically help you make a decision. So not just be nice to have, to help you kind of winnow down the idea that we've got lots of data. What data do you want to be able to make a decision? And this is just hard. And I can't, I don't know if there's a way to kind of summarize this process for you. It might take just a conversation internally. This is the type of thing that, I'm at a foundation conference right now. And so telling foundations, all right, so just figure out some metrics you to figure out your impact. I mean, that's like a 2-year strategy project. So it could be something that takes more time. You definitely want to think about whether you have this data. Where is it going to come from? How easy is it going to be to pull? What kind of transfer? So is this something that I can just easily get the data and plop it in a bar chart, or is it coming from 19 different systems and they all need to be, morphed and deduped before anything can be done? Because that's going to inform things. If it's something's going to be super hard, well, then it needs to be pretty darn useful before you go there, or at least to start there. And this is often, like I said, the hardest part of this process. So don't just kind of assume, and then we'll figure out some metrics. We'll dump some numbers. Peter mentioned this in part of the very number 1, that this is that. All right. So what metrics are we going to do to measure the mission? May not be practical. It'd be ideal certainly, but just doing something to have something useful out there might well be a good way to start.
So a great example I have, Laura, again, at Goodwill was that, I mentioned earlier that, we were a workforce development agency. And I know people think of Goodwill for the thrift stores, and not us, I don't work there anymore. But when we talked about what metrics are going to tell us that we are transforming lives, that we, it wasn't that we got somebody a job, it's that they stayed in the job, or they went and got a better job or something like that. And we had no data on that. We weren't tracking any retention data at all. So instead of coming up with that dashboard immediately, we came up with the strategies to track retention data, to, how can we stay engaged with the people who have been through our system and are on the other side of it so that we know how they're doing, things like that. So it was really a long-term strategy there.
Absolutely. Kristin, how did you guys go about thinking through what specific kind of numbers and metrics to show on the dashboard?
Well, we knew we wanted to start with the information that we already had in our case management system, and then add some metrics. So it took us a while, since we were adding the maps, it took us a while to figure out what we wanted to geocode. Do we want county? Do we want congressional district? Why do we care about congressional district, and why would we add that? It took a couple conversations to figure out what would be helpful, and we actually added a housing authority district, which we never envisioned we would add, but it's practically more helpful to our case handlers to have that than congressional district. So, and then we decided to primarily use what we had, because we really have just lots of data about our work in our case management system, but we are also adding some things to it, like client feedback. We're adding into the system that we don't currently put into the system. We're in the process of adding that into Legal Server so that we can dashboard it. And we're also, we have an economic impact study, and part of the project is to add that information into Legal Server so we can dashboard it. But for the most part, we didn't want to spend a lot of time collecting stuff that we don't already collect.
Right. So. Fantastic. All right, so that gets us to the place of the technology that's going to facilitate all of this, which, as I mentioned, is not really the silver bullet one might hope it will be. So how do you actually take all this data and create a dashboard out of it? So the start is your existing legal case management, which is likely to have more of the data you want to summarize than anything else. So to figure out what it can do, or potentially what modules you could add that would help you to dashboards you want on top of the data. So that's kind of an obvious answer, which may or may not be possible. So it may or may not be possible to get your legal case management system to do what you want. This is potentially equally, you could, in fact, a lot of people do, think about an Excel spreadsheet. So in fact, there are a number of organizations who are doing quite compelling things by creating Excel spreadsheets where data is simply pasted. You create a report in one system, you paste it into tab 3, you create another report in another system, you paste it into tab 5, and tab 1 is the dashboard, which automatically updates into a set of useful charts and graphs. So it may not be the super robust technology solution that you're thinking of, but it may in fact be totally sufficient to your needs. So a plug-in reporting tool. So certainly worth looking into what you can plug into your system. So for is using Legal Server with additional modules, which can provide more flexibility. There are ones that are outside the specifically the legal aid realm, things like Tableau, which can plug in existing database or data model and help you to visualize things on top of it. So this is conceptually like something like Crystal Reports or something like that, though Tableau is specifically one of the things it does is graphical dashboards. So to visualize data that is reasonably together.
I do have to throw in, though, because we looked very carefully at Tableau here, that even with their nonprofit discount, the pricing model was insane. Not something that we could justify.
It is, I believe it is seat-based, Peter. In fact, it probably had to do with the size of LSC, because, in fact, I think it's fairly affordable for small nonprofits. Does that resonate or no?
Okay, then I won't rule that out completely, but I will say that we looked at, a number of different ways to do it with very few seats, and it still ended up being kind of out there for us. I mean, they have a free portal, but you have to be able to upload your data to them, and it doesn't work if you've got data that's confidential. So I don't think that's going to work in virtually any legal aid organization.
Great. Okay, so possibly Tableau a little more. We'll take another look at that. A little more expensive.
Yeah.
Was. So there's also a whole realm of dashboard tools. So things like iDashboards, Good Data, Burst, ClickView. All of these tools do approximately the same thing, which is that they help you map to basically this other data model and then help you to visualize it. So basically the idea is that you are importing data either automatically if you can get it or possibly by hand, and it can put together a couple of different frameworks to help you to visualize it. But basically this is very conceptually similar to that Excel spreadsheet. So there is a fair amount of work to do to figure out how to get your data talking to each other in a way that will work, and that's set up behind this. Peter, did you compare any of these tools to Tableau when you were looking at Tableau?
We looked a little bit at QuickView. I'm not familiar with the others.
Okay. Yeah. Or you could think about and they're all kind of similar to each other. There's a whole different kind of business intelligence tool. So something like Crystal Reports or Cognos. They vary in price, but they're all going to require a technical investment to get up and running as a dashboard. So Crystal Reports, if you haven't looked at it in a while but are familiar with it of old, it certainly will do very pretty things. So this is obviously not legal aid, a fruit trade dashboard helping Crystal Reports. But they're all going to take some substantial technical setup. Or down the here, you could custom build something. If you have a lot of different sources of data, then in fact it might be as practical to basically just build visualization stuff on top of where they are already, as opposed to trying to get them out and into something else. But, you know, obviously, as always, when you're building your own thing, then you're also you're basically investing in updating it and managing it, and, you know, it's all going to be a more difficult endeavor than using something out of the box. Peter, can you talk a little bit about you were looking at these different tools, some of the things that kind of just came to mind as things that were key comparators?
We did some cursory looks just because, you know, we do have absolutely a goal to get to data visualization. You know, I would make a pitch for Salesforce here in it that Salesforce can be a pretty rapid and easy environment. You know, I'm not saying that anybody could just do it by loading Salesforce, but the learning curve to develop these type of metrics and things in Salesforce is pretty easy. And the ability to publish from Salesforce to a website means that you could get the free 10-user donation and have the people who are building the dashboard use those licenses, but still publish the dashboard to a web page or something like that not everybody has to have the Salesforce license. So it becomes very affordable. And as I said, a pretty good environment to do it. One thing I'll just share is that when we looked at our platform for data management here at LSC, most of the, Oracle, all that was way beyond our price range.
Right.
But Microsoft and Salesforce kind of came in at pretty much the same price point, either getting Salesforce or getting what we looked at Microsoft was a combination of Microsoft CRM and SharePoint. The difference was that if we went with Microsoft, we would really have to hire a .NET developer at that salary. And if we went with Salesforce, the existing staff could manage it. We didn't have to hire anybody if we went that route, because it's so much easier to develop for Salesforce than it is to do the whole .NET thing. And some considerations.
So kind of a takeaway from all of this is that, that it's difficult to say much about dashboard tools without really thinking through where the from. And ideally, you would just build on top of where it's coming from, though that may or may not be practical. Stan asks a great question. So does Legal Server allow direct access to the data so that you can link a dashboard directly to it, or must you export data from reports in Excel to the dashboard? And Kristin has answered, so their dashboard tools, so the modules that they bought as extra modules, use report parts. So the part of Legal Server called report parts. So no exporting is necessary. You get real-time data. Kristin, do you have any idea if you were using a dashboard which wasn't Legal Server's own, whether you would be able to get kind of programmatic access to the data to hook it in? So are there APIs or other things like that?
My experience with Legal Server and APIs is that they want to custom design the API for the program you're wanting to connect to. So that would be a TIG. Okay. Or you could just, the reports in Legal Server will generate an Excel spreadsheet. So if you're trying to connect it to Crystal Reports, for example, you can just use an import it into Crystal Reports with Excel.
Yeah, and I think that especially as you're getting started, I would encourage you not to think about dashboards as almost a mental model, a reporting mechanism, as opposed to a technology. To say, okay, so what would the executive team want in order to be able to report on things, to decide on things, and then let's create some stuff that's straightforward to create, perhaps in Excel or something else, and give it to them and see whether that is in fact what they want. So to start the iteration process without a gigantic investment in technology.
And for those folks who have Legal Server and have moved to the new interface in Legal Server, a lot of the things that I use to make my dashboards are out of the box, not extra, for to make a dashboard. So just because you don't have a TIG grant to buy these extra modules doesn't mean you can't make a dashboard in Legal Server if you use the new interface. It just might not have quite as many bells and whistles.
Great. Fantastic. Speaking of bells and whistles, so I wanted to just quickly touch on the idea of designing your charts and displays. So this is also something that people, when they think of a dashboard, they tend to think of something very polished and potentially something that I find is often overly glitzy. You want to make sure that your data itself is allowed to speak, so that the idea is not to provide something so very fancy that it impresses people, but rather to define something that's clean and straightforward so that you can see what the data is. This is, so everybody at Idealware knows this. These kinds of speedometer type dial graphics are one of my pet peeves, because this, in fact, is not giving you anything with all of this real estate that you couldn't show in the number with the color code. Like, so, all right, we're at $110,000. That's really bad. We're going to make that very bright red, you know? There's a lot of fanciness going on here, but it's not really adding, you're taking up a lot of room for something that is essentially a number and a status. So make sure that you think about not, okay, what's the prettiest we can make this, but what's the clearest and the most useful? Kristin, any kind of thoughts from the field in actually creating, data formats that people can understand and use?
Yeah. So what I did is I found that in many instances I needed to display the data in two different ways to help people understand it. So I oftentimes you'll see a pie chart and a bar graph right next to each other in our dashboard, and the pie chart will not let somebody drill down into and get details on the data, and the bar chart will. So I found that to be really helpful because people like the big picture of the pie chart, and then the functionality in Legal Server that lets you drill down with the bars is very helpful for people really kind of digging deep into the data a little more.
Terrific. Yeah, absolutely. Great. Thank you so much. Let us just talk a little bit about implementing and rolling out. So this is obviously a really critical piece. It is not dramatically different than with any other technology system, so we're not going to dwell a lot on it. So you obviously want to make it happen, so you're going to build it. I will boil down the entire, implementation process of everything we've just talked to into one slide. So then it happens, there's the black box, the magic happens, and you roll it out to the right people. And you want to make sure that you think about that rollout thoughtfully, that you don't just put it down in front of people and expect that that's going to be sufficient to get them productively using it and to start the iteration process. People might well need training on how they're supposed to be reading this, what they're supposed to be doing with it, how to think about it. So you basically, as any technology system, it doesn't matter if this is awesome and has all sorts of fantastic information if no one ever looks at it. So you want to think about that rollout process. Peter, I suspect that you have rolled out many a thing in your time. What would you add about the idea of trying to get people to actually use the thing?
To kind of reiterate what Kristin said earlier, if you build it, or maybe say the opposite, if you build it, they won't come. I'm a great believer that if people aren't asking you for what you're rolling out, your chances of success are nearly nil. People have to be engaged, long before you've started developing it, that this is something that they need and they'll use and they want. That's the first battle. Second is user involvement. Keep people involved. Have a committee of people who are advising you, who are going to be the main end users of it. At staff meetings and things, show people where you are. People will definitely have a lot more buy-in if they're involved in the process of building it to some extent. and that can be even a very tiny extent, just that they don't feel like they're left out of it and that they were surprised by it.
Yeah.
And one of my rules that I operate on is I never want to surprise anybody with anything. So communication is very key. Those are a couple. And then, I know in our environments it's hard to get people to take training seriously, but the any ways you can strategize to get people to show up for the training, being respectful. We rolled out a phone system here a couple months ago, and the trainers went an hour and a half training class, and I told them, forget it. We can't do that. We're not going to do that. But, I helped them prioritize what they could do in an hour,
Yeah. Kristin, did you find that it was fairly easy to get people to buy into it and use it, or was that more of a challenge?
Well, we haven't rolled it out completely yet. And the audience for our executive dashboard, which is rolling out now, they're a closed audience and they want it. So
right.
I'm not having any issue getting them to use it. I did make a dashboard kind of on the fly, as dashboards in a case management system can solve problems for people. So I made a dashboard for our intake staff, and it's just very lowbrow. It's just these are this week's rejected cases, and here are the intake numbers for the whole program, just on one little tab, so that they can easily access it. And so what I have found helps me implement things like that is that I always thank the person whose idea started the idea. They didn't say, "Oh, Kristin, build me a dashboard." They just pointed out a problem to me, and I said, "I can solve that with a dashboard." And then every time I make an improvement from, where somebody points out something they don't like, I just thank them for the idea to make it better. And then everybody feels invested in the project because they're getting thanked for all their wonderful ideas. And that is really helps generate good PR and good buzz in our program for new bits of technology.
Right.
And then, so that's what I do.
Fantastic.
That's great.
Great, yeah. All right, and this is basically just smacking home a theme that we've talked about over and over again. Really important for dashboards in particular that you want to start small and basically use your beginning as part of the process of figuring out what people are going to use, and to plan to iterate it, as opposed to rolling out this gigantic thing. So I can tell you that we initially did a bunch of dashboard research for the foundation world, and one of the people we talked to was the Gates Foundation. And in fact, the Gates Foundation is doing tons with dashboarding, but it is all iterative, program by program, and then potentially rolling up if needed. So they are basically just creating things ad hoc to user needs. And so spending, 8 hours to say, all right, great, here's something. And then basically letting things that our people actually are using or, equally complaining about. If people are complaining about it, it means that they'd like to use it and can't. And letting things boil up to the top to be then worked on more and potentially aggregated together. So you want to basically think of this as a process. So you're going to define it. You're going to then actually implement something. You're going to figure out whether it's working. I'd say in this realm, you don't necessarily need to actively measure as much as solicit feedback, refine it, and basically start the cycle again. So define what the next iteration is, et cetera. And it's important to recognize that, in fact, if you help people to visualize the data, it may well actually affect the data itself in sometimes really useful ways and sometimes in ways that are hard to predict. So for instance, if not 100% of people are entering all data, and then you suddenly are reporting on, well, hopefully not suddenly, as Peter said, but then we are non-suddenly reporting on the amount of cases that each attorney has closed, then somebody who isn't closing any of their cases will suddenly look like they're not doing any work. So that might improve the quality of the data. On the other hand, in that same example, you have attorneys potentially incented to close cases, so which could, in some circumstances and some attorneys, maybe make the cases themselves go in a direction you might not want. So someone might be very eager to wrap up a case. So this is essentially teaching to the test that what you're measuring could have the potential of actually affecting what your staff is doing. So it's important. It's another reason to start small so that you can see the consequences of what you're doing in small ways before they become, big and potentially problematic.
So Laura, I think you're bringing up more of a meta issue when it comes to dashboards in the first place, which is that there are in our organizations people who are very nervous about the idea of actually having data. I've run into a problem at a nonprofit law firm where I asked where we kept the metric of cases closed, and I was told we don't keep that. We like to feel good about our work, and it's too depressing a stat. That wouldn't fly in legal aid, but it's because LSC won't let you. But it did there, and I was aghast. And I had long conversations with the attorneys about it, and they were like, no, we have a culture that having that data available would hurt our culture. So there are that's just something that right at the outset to consider, is to have the organizational buy-in at the top that you want to manage by understanding what you do in with data, not with good feelings and vibes.
Yep. And I do think I totally agree with that. And in addition to that, I think that there is the possibility that, like standardized tests, standardized tests do a lot of great things and help us to compare students and across states and stuff like that. But it also affects the way that people teach. And so you want to think about that, and you want to understand that before you go too far down a rabbit hole that might make things go in some strange direction. So, Kristin, have you had any, so it sounds like you've just now started to roll it out, but has there been in any ways that you're suspecting that either the quality of the data or the tenor of the work might differ at all from based on what you're doing?
Well, not yet, but in the beginning of the project, we did have a lot of discussions about what we would do with the data and whether or not we would distribute one program's data to other programs within our organization. And our executive director really felt that, in many instances, we're comparing apples to oranges, and he really didn't want people to feel like they were being compared to each other. Like we do have that culture in our organization. We don't want that, but so we made it. It's intentional that when a manager logs into the program, they're going to see their program stuff, or they're going to see the entire program stuff. And if they go looking, they can find it. But we don't want that to come centrally, because we don't want people to feel that kind of stress. There's other kinds of stress that they already naturally feel. We didn't want to add to it. But I do expect that if our folks see their time, like that's one of the things we have planned is their time entries and their cases and their outcomes for their cases to be displayed for them. We're hoping that it will be both inspirational and motivational. So if they can see that their time is lagging behind their coworkers or just lagging, that they'll correct that, and if their outcomes are lagging, that they will talk to their manager about how to change their workflow to reflect the outcomes that they want, to feel good about the work they're doing. So that is our hope for it, but it's still in the infancy.
Absolutely. Kristin, so you've been talking a lot about kind of the process as we've stepped through the process. Are you willing to talk a little bit about your dashboards themselves? And I'm not sure how familiar you are with the slides we have for you, but you can just talk to this one and tell me when you're done, and I will go to the next one.
Yes. So you want me to talk about the bits and pieces of this slide?
Or kind of, this is more the, kind of just give us some context as to just kind of pull together some of the context that you've been providing throughout.
Yeah, so we, a couple of years ago, we had an economic impact study done for the state of Georgia for legal services in the state of Georgia. And so we had this economic impact study in the works, and my executive director was super excited about it. He loves to hear about the economic impact of our work, and he thinks it's going can really help us expand our funding. And I think he's right. And so he said, well, let's do a TIG project on, and let's do data visualization about our economic impact. And I said, well, Legal Server has these tools, and let's make a dashboard. And he said, great, let's make a dashboard. And then he pointed out the maps and said, I like that map and I don't like that map. And so we have maps now in Legal Server. And so currently what the map that we have shows our current open cases for the whole state of Georgia, which shows that our statewide hotline and some of our specialty projects do cases outside our service area. And then it has our LSC and non-LSC funded cases in a little line graph here, so that we kind of keep into perspective all of our variety of funding sources and whether or not we're using our LSC funds appropriately. And this is one example of me displaying the data in two different ways. So there's the line chart and then the pie chart that displays both the same information. And then the graph, we're still working with Legal Server on the map. We're working with Legal Server on the colors and the gradients in the map. So what you should be seeing is the darker colors represent zip codes, where we have a higher density of population of clients, and then the lighter colors are where we have fewer. And we're still working out the details of the map. I think the map is just like was the idea for the TIG grant, and it is an example of very complicated tech behind dashboard that what I've basically done is found other ways to demonstrate the majority of the information we need for the dashboard because the mapping is very complicated. For example, we're validating all of our addresses when we enter the client data into Legal Server, and they basically backwards validated a year or two's worth of our data, but the case handler can go ahead, it can manually change like the county, for example. So the system is having trouble mapping it. If the validated address says that it was Cobb County and then manually for some reason it got changed to Madison County, the system doesn't know what to do with that. And so we have a lot of technical details to work out with the mapping that were unanticipated. And so I love the map, and I'm not giving up on the map. I like the map. But in the meantime, we have the bar graph and the line. So we're doing what I'm saying is don't get hung up on displaying the data in a particular way because there are many different ways to display the same data.
Yep.
Make sense?
Absolutely.
So that's that slide.
Great.
Yeah. Okay, so these are open cases. This is another example of the same data basically displayed two different ways. The pie chart gives you just a very brief overview, and like where I explained to you that you're looking at apples and oranges. This would say, oh well, look at the downtown office. They're really doing a lot more than the South Side office. But the downtown office has a higher population to serve, and they have 3 specialty units in that office, and 3 times the attorneys. So you can use in the Legal Server interactive graphs and charts system with this bar chart. They're building like a clear all. So like these are all our projects, and they're all a different color, and you can glance at it and see all the different projects in all the different offices and the cases represented by each project by color. And then you could clear it and dial down and just look at the eviction defense project, for example, and get details about that project, or just get details about one particular office. And so you can get more detailed information and try to compare apples to apples. For example, if you wanted to compare all the pro bono projects, you could just highlight those projects, and that's all the graph would show you.
Right.
So found that to be very helpful.
Can you just talk a little bit, Kristin, about how these actually, so we're looking at all of these kind of different report bits, which are obviously at home on pages. Can you just talk a little bit about how people actually navigate this? Like, do they go to a specific part of Legal Server, and how do they choose between these things, stuff like that?
Yeah, so what I've done, so right now the part of the dashboard that is built out in Legal Server is it's on the home page. When you log into Legal Server, there are several tabs where you can make decisions on where to go in Legal Server, and there's a dashboard tab. And eventually there'll be a dashboard tab that is customized by the user. So right now I haven't turned that feature on, so there's just one dashboard. And then, but in the future, if you're a manager, you'll see the manager dashboard. And if you're on the executive team, you'll see the executive dashboard. If you're a case handler, you'll see the case handler dashboard. If you're an intake worker, you'll see the intake dashboard. So, but right now, it's just a tab. And you click the tab, and you see the graphs and charts.
Perfect.
So it's just great. One click off the home page.
Great. And if you had to do a kind of you're not all the way through, so I don't want to say if you had to do it all over again. But if you needed to start from the beginning, what would you do differently about the project than you actually did in practice?
I would maybe make sure the technology was developed before I planned it, because one of the things that I did is I planned the dashboard, planned version 1 of the dashboard, thinking that technology was going to look a particular way. And then when I had a serious, check-in with PS Technologies about what the technology was going to look like, it was actually somewhat different. So I would really use what you have. Our project is to develop the technology, so I guess it's not a great example. But if I were not doing this in a TIG project, I would have the technology, I would not build anything new. I would say, okay, what is it that I'm capable of doing? And then I would build the dashboard from there, because our dashboard looks a lot different than we thought it would look. I still like it, and I still think it's functional, but I wouldn't have had to plan it twice if I, So that's what I would do. And maybe I would have walked around with copies of other programs' dashboards or other sample dashboards when we had the talk with the managers about what do you want, because they were like, oh, well, I don't want a map. What do I need a map for? I got 50 cases to handle,
Right.
So.
Fantastic.
So.
Questions for Kristin before we move onward. I do, in fact, have 2 other kind of quicker case studies to talk through. Brian or Peter, questions for Kristin?
Not a question, but definitely a comment on the technology side. When working on NJP's dashboards, we brought in an information school student from University of Washington to put together some conceptual stuff that then we had to go back and look at what was really possible given the visualizations that were available to us. It was nice from a brainstorming perspective, but it did create a little bit of a challenge, and we'd shown some people some prototypes that then we found out later were just clearly impossible. So I think we could have managed that part of that iterative process a little bit better.
That's interesting. It's almost is that as opposed to blue skying it and then trying to map it to technology to try to think through what technology is practical and to kind of map the needs to the technology before getting too far down the road. Interesting.
Right.
We similarly. Go ahead, Peter.
Just, you talked about the difficulty with the mapping application. So, some of you might have heard this story from me before, but we had a similar problem here when we decided to redo the Find Legal Aid section of our website and have an interactive map. But we found a group called DC Legal Hackers who were having a hackathon, and ours became their signature project from that. So they did half of that work for us. So there are, there are free resources out there. There are lots of people all over the country, civil-minded hackers out there who are willing to help with that kind of thing. And mapping in particular is an example where some, smart techie law student might really have a handle on that stuff, whereas in-house, we know SQL, but we didn't know anything about that side of it.
Great. Fantastic. So let's talk about two more case studies, and I'm going to talk through these in about 5 minutes each, and then we'll have some time at the end for questions, or we'll wrap up early. So Blue Ridge Legal Services, this is almost the opposite of Kristin's case study. This is, what they they did a prototype in Excel, in essence, and you are using it to think through what's possible. So what you're looking at is a set of static charts and graphs built in Microsoft Excel, and in fact built fairly painstakingly over time. There's no kind of automatic calculation behind these. They've simply been created by looking at data and then, parsing and analyzing data and creating graphs. In specific, they've been looking at kind of more of the operational side of things. So they've been looking at individual performance reports and results of casework and client satisfaction. So these are, you can think about this, and we have another slide. You can think of these as almost prototypes for a dashboard. So they are dashboards. They are dashboards that are manually created in Excel. So they're not. It's not a dashboard that is easy to create every day or every week. But it's some really interesting information to be able to both see what's going on and also then to have something to put in front of people and say, great, here's some information. Is this useful to you? What would make this more useful to you? So I feel like something like this is a great first step. You could also, in fact, you could take another step technically by, after you have created, you've kind of analyzed out what charts and graphs you want to use, you could then have those in Excel and try to automate a little bit more the data behind it. So as opposed to, spending 2 hours to create each set of graphs, you would have a copy and paste it from a report onto a tab and then a different report onto a tab. So it would be slightly more automated and certainly not take as much time. Kristin was saying that Blue Ridge is actually one of our inspirations for their project. Kristin, you want to just talk a little about what inspired you about these?
Yeah, so I read an article called "You Get What You Measure."
Absolutely.
It's very old, written by the folks at Blue Ridge Legal Services, and that was my inspiration for how I wanted to morph the grand executive dashboard idea into something useful for our management. And that's what inspired us to add client feedback to the project. I really love what they do with their dashboards and how they use it as a tool to inspire their staff.
Yep.
I think they've done a great job. But I really didn't want to manually do it.
Right.
Really didn't want to manually do it.
Right. And they definitely would like to create a more templated version and ideally allow staff to quickly create dashboards from reports or queries. But I think this is a good example of how dashboards are not specifically tied to a particular technology. Like, you don't need a dashboard technology to create a dashboard. It can certainly make things easier once you know what you're doing, but once you know what you want to do. But figuring out what you want to do is a notable thing in of itself. All right, and one that has taken the same idea a little bit further. Utah Legal Services in 2010 also used the TIG to develop dashboards on top of Kemp. So looking specifically at their performance reports. So this is just the one that we looked at. So this is we looked at a slightly different version from the same dashboard earlier, where we were talking about how terrible Terry was at submitting her or closing her cases. So this is another one of their performance statistics. So this is looking at how much time each of their people are spending on cases compared to projects that were not cases, so kind of professional development or internal projects or things like that. And so this is, you probably wouldn't want to necessarily compare this apples to apples to say, Lewis, you're doing so well because you're spending so little time on projects. But to think of this as, all right, is there a reason for this? What does this mean to me? Should Luis be working more on cases? Here's the graph that we looked at earlier in regards to, let's just look at it a little more specifically. So this is the number of times so it's the number of notes that have been unchanged over 30 days, 60 days, and 90 days. So this red bar means that she's got about 25 cases where the notes have not changed in 3 months, but they're not closed. So this is also, basically something to use to say, hey, Terry, what's the deal here? Bob doesn't seem to have any trouble updating his case notes. So a much more operational lens on things. So again, these have been built on top of Kemp with help from the vendor. All right, so that brings us to the end of our regularly scheduled content, but we'd love your questions, comments, thoughts. Craig, I know that, so Craig from Utah Legal Services is in fact out there on the chat, I believe. Craig, anything that you would add about this through the chat that I have not said? Or other questions from other people?
Just to make sure people know, this has been recorded. We will be putting it up on YouTube where all of our other trainings are available. There's also a link in the chat to fill out a survey if you have any feedback for us on this.
Great. And let's just, to wind up, let me ask you all out there to, oh, I'm sorry, so Craig has actually corrected me, so an important correction. That they put this together themselves without help from Kemp. So no help was gotten, and we can all read whatever we want into that from Kemp. Thanks, Craig, for the correction. Let's wrap up by, I'd love all of you out there just to think of potentially, one thing that you've taken away with you that you would take back to your organization, and just enter into the chat in a couple of words. And while you're thinking about that and entering that into the chat, so just one thing that you're taking away, let me just ask Peter and Kristin for just a very short parting word of wisdom. Peter, if there's only one thing that people took away with them, what would you want it to be?
Well, I did have something I want to say. I'll make it as quick as possible, which is that think about the ROI. You saw examples of, the have legal servers and the not have legal servers, because my understanding is legal server is the only case management system that actually has dashboarding built in. I know Kemp has some rudimentary dashboards, but I don't think it's anything at the same level. But even if you're doing this in Excel and putting a lot of labor into it, the return on investment is going to be a couple of things. It's going to be the case that you can make to funders, funders besides LSC, and it's going to be the information that people have at their fingertips that they're wasting a lot of hours trying to put together today. So always kind of do that evaluation about whether it's worth investing in a dashboard, and those are two things that I think are probably the key things that are going to justify the amount of work that, particularly, again, if you're doing it in Excel or in a kind of labor and time-consuming fashion.
Great. Fantastic. And Kristin, your thoughts, one thing that you would take away, that you would hope that people would take away?
Well, I think that the best thing they can do is to just get started on creating, even a simple dashboard in Excel that helps visualize important data for their program. It doesn't have to be a big, giant project to have an impact. And in fact, so far, what has been most impactful has been the little intake dashboard that I threw up in 10 minutes. You know, it doesn't need to be anything big and major. It's just putting data at the fingertips of the people that need it has a huge impact. So,
absolutely. Great. And Brian, you mentioned something into the chat. You want to just repeat it? Elaborate?
Yeah, definitely. It's the get the staff members that would actually be using the dashboard involved as soon as possible and use an iterative design process so that their feedback is really taken into account so they have ownership in it.
Yep, absolutely. Terrific. And a bunch more other great thoughts here. Yes, you get what you measure. And resist unnecessary glitz. Yeah, displayed in a useful way, says Jamila. Absolutely. Yeah, and it's okay to start small. I would echo Kristin in that, to kind of think of it as, all right, you're building a little tiny snowball, and then you hope that it's gonna roll and it's gonna collect more snow, and it's, you know, maybe it's gonna start a data avalanche, you know. But you got to start somewhere, and the somewhere is not with a $100,000 gigantic project. It's something that you can take on right now that'll be useful. Fantastic. All right, so I think that we are at an end. I will give you 10 minutes of your day back. Thank you so much, and let me turn it back over to Brian to wrap us up.
Thank you, everybody, for showing up. We greatly appreciate the feedback, and watch out for us on our blog and on email for other events going on throughout the year. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks, everybody, and I'll see you soon.
Thanks all.